Are you a church leader trying to navigate the tension of doing ministry both online and in person? Welcome to the Bricks and Clicks Church Leadership Podcast, a podcast where church leaders and ministry experts share ideas, solutions, and experiences about making church work both in person and online. Meet the hosts of Bricks and Clicks, a Brit and an Aussie who became friends in their efforts of making churches irresistible. Duncan Banks lives just outside London, England, and Jason Perkins lives in Brisbane, Australia. Without further ado, here are your hosts, Banksy and Perko.
Hey, listen, let's jump in. As Jason said, we're doing this thing, we're talking around the subject of equipping the core. You know, Andy dropped this bombshell a few months back about North Point's new emphasis, North Point's new passion. And that was to endear themselves to their local community, inspire the crowd, and then equip the core. And so we're hanging around a little bit with Bill, talking about what does it mean to equip the core. Just before I dive into the first question, Bill, you've been on staff at North Point since day one, really, haven't you? Give us a little bit about of your journey, because you were involved in starting this thing called North Point Community Church when it was just a handful of you. Give us a bit of a taste of the journey from then to where you are now.
Yeah, so we were a startup kind of experience with a little bit of a mass crowd. I like to say we're not the typical church plant, for sure. We were already a group of friends that were serving at another church, but to see the journey that God has taken us on has far exceeded, obviously, anything we could imagine. And I love that, because then it's the story of God and not the story of a few knuckleheads who are trying to figure out how to do church. And so that's really what our story is all about, is God took some very normal, ordinary people and has allowed us to be on a journey, what I hope has always been about his heart, which is about reaching those who believe nothing or who have had a bad church experience, and then help take them on a journey of hopefully finding not just that there is a God and it's not them, but that hopefully they realize that there is a God who dearly loves them, wants to have a relationship with them, and actually wants to do this thing called life through them. And that's the joy.
That's great. So this is like the board you can't afford, guys. You don't often get the chance to have someone like Bill sat there willing to answer your questions, willing to get elbow deep into your life and your stuff and your issues. So here's your chance to drop those questions into the chat, and we'll make sure they get asked as we go along the way. Bill, let me dive in the first question. I obviously, and I know Jason does the same, we spend a lot of time in the UK and Ireland and in Australia talking with church lead pastors and church leaders. And the one thing that comes back to me time and time again is leaders say, when the storm of COVID hit 18 months ago, I was quite surprised. In fact, beyond surprised, some of them said they were shocked, jaw hitting, like in those cartoons, jaw hitting the floor kind of moment, how shallow people's faith were. We thought, pastors were saying to me, we thought we were doing a great job at discipling people, at growing people up in their faith. We thought we had a strong core, people who were really passionate about following Jesus. But then COVID hit and people started to drift away from church, drift away from each other, drift away from faith. And so it wasn't as strong as we thought. And so as we're coming out of COVID now and going back into gathering and going back into figuring out what church looks like, pastors are saying, do we just go back to doing discipleship like we used to? Or is there another way of doing it? And I wondered what you thought. I mean, if you were to give yourself a mark out of 10 for how you were doing up until COVID in equipping your core, what would that mark be? How pleased with you were you as a church at how strong your core were? Or did you have the same kind of responses as we did?
Yeah, no, I think we all were surprised, right? If you look over the last, I can look at 20 or 30 years, major life events that have happened in the world and certainly in our nation that have riveted us to the core, whether it was the economic meltdown of 2009, whether it was 9/11 for us, coming up on 20 years. Yeah. You saw a lot of people who you thought were well grounded really shook up. And I think it reminded me of a C.S. Lewis statement when he said, people need to be reminded more than they need to be instructed. I think we were reminded of some things, if I could, and we shouldn't have been surprised, Duncan, in some respects, because look at the disciples. They walked with Jesus for 3 years, and they saw Jesus do the miracles. And then when it got really rough, see ya, they were out. And so it shouldn't totally shock us what's in the human heart. Okay. But here's a couple of things that we learned. The first one, I think, is that, hey, life, regardless of the circumstances, is fragile and unpredictable at times. That's just a reality. So the question is, when life happens, where do you go? Who do you call? What do you trust in? God created us to be dependent on him, but he also created us to be interdependent on one another. Yeah. And so people who walk connectedly with other people have other voices during those really rough seasons, which can really provide a couple of things. It can provide perspective when we need it most. And it can also provide us with a recentering of what matters most when life gets uncertain for us. So I think one of the things we learned is, hey, life in general can be fragile and unpredictable. And so the question is going to be, who's in our life who helps us interpret the circumstances of life to bring us back to a recentering and to a proper perspective. Yeah. The other thing that I would say, a second learning that I think we had is that, community is really important in all of life, not just in the storms of life. I mean, when people are connected well, they're more challenged to grow because there's iron sharpening iron as a result. They're more supported when we stumble. I love the passage in Luke 17:1, which says, things that cause people to stumble are bound to come. Thanks, Luke. Yeah, they are. And what are those things that are bound to come? Well, disappointment, unemployment, disease, death, those things in life that kind of shake us to our core are bound to come. But when we've got other people in our lives, we have people that we can lean on, we can lean into. They can be our strength. They can be the source of hope for us when we don't have hope. And then obviously we're comforted when we suffer loss. So there's a lot of things that happen as a result of being in community that can't happen. I think this is so important as we navigated COVID, because we all know the impact that COVID had on the mental health of our communities. Yeah. And, anxiety and depression. Our recent CDC study here, Centers for Disease Control in the US, anxiety and depression everywhere, but for the States was up over 50%. I mean, top out numbers. Wow. Suicide and suicidal ideation was up significantly. It hit real close to home in our community here. Job loss, especially in those first 10 to 12 weeks of the pandemic, was crazy. And people who, especially in the service industry, were losing everything. So, thankfully, one of the things that I am encouraged by is that those who were connected, we were able to pivot to a digital platform so they could stay connected. Yeah. It didn't mean that they didn't have fears. And I think we have to be careful not to look at it in exacting terms, that everybody's all in or everybody's all out. Because the truth of the matter is, I know my heart on a daily basis. The old hymn, I'm prone to wander, prone to lead the God I love, that's me, that's you. And so I want to make sure that, that we aren't so exacting in terms of how we slice things up. We were all fearful. We were all concerned about what the future would look like because we are in an unprecedented season. So, I mean, those are a couple of learnings. The last one, and I think this was a big one. The time to get connected is not when you need it most. The time to get connected is when you need it least, recognizing that there's going to be a time that you're going to need it really bad. Yeah. We got into we started a new group with some old friends, and that's about 1.5 years ago. And this was tragic, but this just happened 3 weeks ago. And I think I mentioned it to you, Duncan, when we talked recently. Mother-daughter went on a trip on a cruise, and they took a little excursion up in Alaska with a float plane, crashed into a mountain, died. I did a funeral 3 weeks ago of people I did their wedding 29 years ago.
Wow.
I mean, these are lifelong friends. To have to navigate what they're doing, and we're literally walking with the husband right now. He's lost his two girls, the woman of his dreams and the girl that God blessed him with. And how do you go forward in the days ahead? How do you even stand? Well, you got to have people around you who can be your source of strength, who can be your hope in those moments, because you got none. You're reeling in those moments. And I know that's pretty extreme, but that's really personal for us right now. And I think, just again, the reminder, time to get connected is not, what if they had not gotten connected a year and a half ago, how would have the husband be navigating these days right now? Probably in a deeper depression and more hopelessness. And we're not trying to tie a bow on what you can't tie a bow on, let's be honest. But what we are trying to do is to help him take it one day at a time, one step at a time, so that he can realize there is a God. He is still good. And he's going to walk with a limp, but we're going to help support him while he does.
Yeah.
Wow, brilliant. Listen, I know Jason's got another question he wants to ask you, Bill, but can I just push into that a little bit more? I'm just in my brain, I can't understand why. If community is so important, and we know it, all of us know it, all of us want deep friendships, intentional friendships, where at 3 o'clock in the morning, when you're feeling rough, you have someone you can call and they won't mind. You can just drop by and knock on their door and they're glad to see you any time of the night and day. You need someone you can celebrate with when good news comes. We know that. But why is it when tragedy and hard times and COVID and all that, why do we run away from the thing that we know we need the most? I don't understand. When we seem to turn around and go a different way to community rather than run towards community, when community is and friendship is the thing that's going to hold us up and keep us strong. What goes on in the human mind that means we do that?
I wonder if we don't get to a place where we think we're the only ones, that I'm wrestling, I'm struggling. And so I don't want to look needy. I don't want to look unfaithful. I don't want to look like the person who, in some cases, let's be honest, we loathe, which is somebody who doesn't get it. And so we're just being challenged in unique ways. And so I just think we go inside ourselves and we go in our heads rather than opening up our lives. And I think that's where we have to resist, and especially as leaders, is call it out, state it for what it is. Hey, there is a tendency. You're either going to be an internal and external processor. There's good sides to both of those. If you're an external processor, you may never really do internal work. If you're an internal processor, you may never truly recognize the value and the encouragement that can come when other people are speaking life. And so I just think there is a tendency for all of us, if we think we're the only ones, we don't want to look stupid. We don't want to look needy. And so that's where not just connection, but honest relationship is so important, because that's where a leader says, hey, you too, me too. I'm in it with you. I feel the same thing. Faith doesn't remove fear. I think it is so important. What was the word of the angels? What was the word of Jesus? Constant, fear not, fear not, fear not, right? Why? Because our propensity and our tendency is to fear. That's why I think people need to be reminded as much as they need to be instructed, is they need to remember God is with us, God is for us, God is in us. And that's just something I need reminder of every day, because who knows what's going to happen with the day before us. And so do you.
Yeah, it's great.
Duncan, Before we hit start on the webinar tonight, Bill, Duncan and I did a little Instagram live just to kind of promote, hey, we're going live with our good friend Bill Willits in half an hour, yada, yada. And I said to Duncan, my thing that I'm looking forward to the most is just, I feel like hanging out with you, Bill, is a great reminder for me. Forget those that I'm leading. Like, this is good for my soul as a leader so that I can hopefully bring my best to those that I'm leading, because we can't give what we don't possess. There's no way we can equip the core if we're not equipped, if we're not being equipped. And so thank you, first of all. I also want to just say really quickly, every leader on the webinar, your next group's message, you've got the bottom line. The best time to get connected is not when you need it most, but when you need it least, so you'll be connected when you need it most. That's the bottom line.
Brilliant.
It's great.
Yeah.
So thank you, Bill. That's a huge gift, because all of us now, we've already got the bottom line for our next big groups message. So thank you for that. That was a huge.
That's great.
Hey, since you guys have put this language around equipping the core, this is not something, and Andy has said this as well, this is not new. It's not something new that you're starting to do. It may be just as some new language around it. Could you define, and this is a bit of a play on words here, but
Sure.
What's core when it comes to equipping the core? So what's the irreducible minimums? What are the core things that you guys are focusing on when it comes to equipping the core? What do they need to be equipped in?
So let me define the core, and then I'll talk about the core. How about that?
Okay, that'd be
so
great.
So when we talk about the core are the people who have missionally engaged with us.
Yeah.
Through one of our ministries. They're the people who are missionally active with us. So that's the core. Those are the people who aren't just attenders. They're partners, right? Yeah. So they're in it with us, and they are the church in the truest sense, in the community, and in their livelihoods, etc. When we talk about equipping the core aspects of equipping, I've always likened it to something that Psalm 78 says. Psalm 78 says that David shepherded the people of God with integrity of heart and skill of hand. There's a heart piece, I think, to equipping, and then there's a hand or a skill piece to equipping. And so when we're talking about equipping the core, personally, we want to help people thrive in developing their walk with Jesus. And so that's the heart piece, continually allowing Jesus to take them where he wants to take them on their spiritual journey. That could be one more step of faith. That could be one more step of forgiveness. That could be one more step of surrender. Whatever that is that we're helping people to pay attention to their hearts and then listen to the Spirit as he's directing them to take a next step on their journey. Then missionally, equipping the core is really all about helping our leaders to excel in their specific role as a ministry leader and missional partner. And so, there's that heart piece. So it's their walk with Jesus. And then there's the skill or hand piece, which is all about their individual ministry. But when we talk about equipping and involving our core, we're trying to lead them on a place of greater ministry partnership or missional engagement with us. And that includes a number of things that we've talked about through the years. But at its core,
yes,
the core is really all about both heart and hand to me.
Yeah, that's so helpful, Bill, for us to be thinking about as we think about content, or I hate using the word, but as we think about programming, the equipping, to think both heart and hand. Can I be a little bit pushy here and just ask kind of a little bit of a question?
Totally.
North Point, I've noticed, have been incredibly focused on the hand. So serving, giving, being in a group, kind of the doing side.
Yes.
And have you guys kind of re-looked at the heart and the being side? Because it's kind of we want to grow them in their being with Jesus, along with what they do for Jesus, the heart and the hand. Do you guys feel like you're looking into that more, or would you say no? We've been doing that well all along. I'm curious to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think there are seasons we've done both fairly well, but I think, yeah, our natural tendency is to go towards skill development and away from heart development and asking those probing questions. And in the last, I would say 3-5 years, we are trying to pay much more attention the condition of the individual and their walk with Jesus. I mean, at the end of the day, when the question is not what did I do, but who did I become?
Yes.
And so who I became actually will impact what I do.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes we look at it just from a missional perspective. And so we have our framework, and so we're pushing hard on the gauges and the levers to get those things moving. And yet we all would say what Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your heart. That's the most important thing. I mean, so I think, can be too assumptive on the heart side of things.
Yeah.
And maybe too prescriptive on the hand side of things. And sometimes we need to reverse the order. We need to be a little bit more about soul care. And I think that's the beauty of leadership development, is that there is something for everyone when you talk heart and hand.
Yes.
But if you start with heart and end with heart, I think you're making the right prioritization.
Yeah. So I would say, quick observation, Bill, even in your message series over the last 3 to 5 years, I think there's been a swing to more heart emphasis, or that being, and then allowing your doing to flow out of it. So I've kind of seen that just as an observation, as an outsider. Duncan, what were you gonna ask? Sorry, I cut you off.
That's fine. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but the framework where all this equipping the core, hand and heart happens primarily for you is in a small group.
Yes, and leader development. So I would say those two things. So our greatest investments are in those who are most greatly involved with us. And so those two areas, in group and in leadership.
So how do you, that's great. So so how again, I'm just trying to ask the questions that all the pastors I spend every day with are asking. And the questions they seem to ask continuously is, my people feel so busy. How on earth do you get, committed core people to jump into a group on a weekly basis every Tuesday night for 2 hours, or to jump into a leader development course for 12 weeks or whatever it might be? How do you at North Point get busy people to realize community is important and get them into those places where they can grow? Because that's the big pushback. Everyone's too busy.
Well, I think, honestly, as church leaders, it starts with us looking at how many asks are we making of people.
That's good.
Are we, people can only do so much. So we have to recognize that we are a tick on the clock for them. We are not the clock. And so I think that's an important piece for us to start with. And I think that we also have to recognize that there is a rhythm. We're not saying every group needs to meet every week. One of the things that I think is a barrier, we just did a survey of disconnected people in our churches. And one of the pieces of feedback that we got was from over half, or just about half of the respondents, was that if there was less, shorter duration and less frequency, I'd be open to it. So what that said to me is that we've got to create little pathways for people to get a taste and see that this is worth my time. So that's why part of our short-term group strategy was put into place, is to give people leverage content as a pathway to community. So if somebody needs help in their marriage or finances or whatever the case may be, there are 4 or 5 parenting, there are 4 or 5 really high level felt need issues that if I can just bring somebody in to talk about it and put people at tables and let them discuss what has just been presented, they're getting a taste of what community life is. And we're not asking them to sign up weekly for the next year. What we're all asking them to do is maybe 4 to 6 weeks is just taste. Here's something that's going to help you. And you're going to see the benefits of talking about it with people in the same season of life that you are. And that just gives them a little bit of a breadcrumb. And then at the end of it, we do is we really push hard longer term community. Okay, you've experienced this. Why don't you take a next step into a group? But the truth of the matter is, Duncan, every group is a 1-week experiment.
Yes,
every group is. Okay. And so we got to remember that. We think people are signing up for a year. Everybody's going to sign up for what they want to sign up for. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we're actually building something together when we get them in a group.
And I was talking to one lead pastor from one of your campuses, and he was telling me that he realized in his group, he's the lead pastor, 8,000-10,000 people in the church. And he was part of a community group, part of a small group. And he realized that half the people in his group wanted community primarily. They wanted to talk about family and work and the weather and sport and just be together and eat pizza, Whereas the other half, they said, yeah, let's get beyond that. I want to pick up the Bible and wrestle with some life issues and what the Bible has to say about that. I want to do something a bit deeper than just chat about sports and make friends. And so he said he realized that was happening in his group. So I asked a bit wider and found out that was happening in the whole church. So they kind of split their groups between community and content groups, if you like. I forgot what he said he called them now, but you were, and you only had 12, there were 12-month groups. And so after 12 months, you might say, I'm done with the friendship thing. I want to get deeper into what the Bible says about the second coming. So I'm going to get into one of these growth groups, I think he called them, one of these growth groups. And then after the 12 months of a growth group, you think, you know what, I want to eat pizza with the boys and enjoy myself a bit. And so there was the flexibility. It wasn't one size fits all where you squeeze everything into one night. There were different flavors. I thought that was a great way of connecting busy people into something they want to do rather than just this general package of pick and choose bits and pieces.
Yes, and it's just a matter of how you present it. We've really actually had 3 tracks, if you will, through our ministry model. We've had a starter track, we've had a community track, and we've had a growth track through the years. We've done them differently. Like many of our campuses, in fact, most of our campuses, instead of growth groups, they actually have mentor groups that is the same content. Our leader development groups, it's the exact same content. It's just targeted for people who want an exceptional mentor in their life and are willing to invest for a 9-month period of time. But the starter track has always been targeted for those who are in transitional seasons of life, whether it is spiritually and they're being curious about the things of faith, whether it's relationally and what's happening in their world. It could be situational. They're just coming out of uni and they're starting their careers. And so we've tried to create wherever people are in those starter seasons to get them connected, then move them into community where they get connected and hopefully experience something. My only concern, and I love points of emphasis like what you just mentioned, I don't want to dumb down community groups to just pizza groups.
Sure.
So I will always resist on that. I think there should be, not everybody is going to want to maybe do a deep dive in Book of Revelation. Totally get it. I don't think most groups should, regardless of the fact, because, Paul calls it mindless chatter, is what it ends up becoming. Yeah. Don't listen. I've been in those settings with other pastors, obviously through theological study. Shoot me. No, it is absolute mindless chatter most of the time. It's kind of the theology of maybe. That's all we're really talking about is, well, you might be right. Yeah. Maybe, it's not really. So I want to be careful that we don't dumb down community, because we talk about it's all about authentic community and spiritual growth. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
You want to do a deeper dive. I love the idea of moving into either those growth groups or those mentor tracks. They're going to help you do that. But I think there should be growth every step of the way.
Yeah.
That's good. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Bill, you talked about authentic community and spiritual growth. You've talked about in the past, North Point's talked about these 3 vital relationships quite often, which is, intimacy with God, community with that insider, and influence with the outsider. I would love for you to just talk to us a little bit as I'm actually going to bring in one of our guests who has a great question, by the way. We're going to bring them in as a panelist so they can ask their question live with you. Kev is going to jump in with us. But while he's jumping in, talk to us about what you would say is maybe the weak link of the 3 vital relationships. Is there one that churches need to pay attention to a little bit more because it can tend to get neglected or it's a little bit weaker?
Yeah. So just to set the table a little bit, when we talk about the 3 vital relationships, that really came out of Matthew 22 when Jesus was asked the question, what's the greatest of all the commandments? And he said, it's to love God and to love others as I have loved you. And so we basically took others and divided into 2 categories, those inside the faith and those outside the faith. So that's where 3 vitals came in: intimacy with God, community with insiders, and influence with outsiders. I would say there's always a vertical and a horizontal piece to when we talk about it. And so the question is, do people need to be challenged more vertically or horizontally, more in their intimacy or more in their relational world, both from an insider and outsider perspective? And to be honest with you, Perko, I think it depends.
Okay.
I mean, I think we can get assumptive about any of them. And I think when we do that, it's at our own peril. I mean, you and I both know spiritual disciplines and intimacy are 2 different things.
Yes.
Disciplines are tools. They're not ends in of themselves. The end is ultimately intimacy. It's John 15, connection to the vine. As Paul said, keeping in step with the Spirit. That's the ultimate goal. So I can say I do disciplines, but I'm not walking intimately.
Yeah.
And so that's an important distinction. I think another, connection and community are 2 different things. Connection is the first step to experiencing the fullness of what biblical community is all about. But we all know you can be in a group and not know the value of what it means to be fully accepted, fully known, and fully supported and loved, which is what biblical community is supposed to be providing.
Yeah.
But all that to say, I would say all 3 are challenging, but we shouldn't presume intimacy. I think that's one thing. And then I would never assume that influence with outsiders is happening. I think that's always the easiest thing to neglect, because I am worried about me and mine, and I forget about others. And so I think as leaders, we've got to model the way in just talking about who outside the faith are we investing in? Who outside of the faith are we connecting with on a regular basis? How are we staying centered with the missional aspect of what God has called us to, which is ultimately the Great Commission and being involved in the lives of those who are far from Him? And I think we can model the way that way. So if you pushed me, I would say it's influence with outsiders, but I'm also on this point of emphasis that don't assume intimacy. Belief and intimacy are 2 different things.
Yeah, absolutely. I love, Bill, great reminder, because you can get to where you're worshiping the practice instead of the person. And so all of a sudden we are, we're checking off the list and I'm doing the disciplines, but man, I'm not walking intimately with Him. So it's great. Thanks.
Yeah. And I might know some people who have done that. Very personally.
Yes. Kev, great to see you, mate, all the way from the Gold Coast, Bill, and you are representing for the Gold Coast. I love that.
That man right there.
Hey, Jeff Henderson would be very proud. I'm absolutely certain, mate. Hey,
He totally would be.
you had a great question for Bill. So why don't I'll just have you ask it, mate. This is really good.
Yeah, it was kind of a more. I did it as a comment. I wasn't really sure about it being a question, but Bill, I am just so grateful for what you are sharing because it's really answering a bunch of questions that I've got. But this is something that I've noticed now coming out of our second lockdown. You guys are probably further down the track, but I'm finding right now out of our second lockdown, a bunch of my old guard, which were good, solid leaders that were right with us all the way, they just suddenly got exceptionally tired. And for some unknown reason, the Lord is calling them to a bigger church with greater resources so that they can just be consumers and just not have to do the hard thing of like being for the Gold Coast about making disciples and making disciples. And I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit on that, whether you're noticing the same thing. And I'm not here to beat up on them. I mean, I get it. I mean, everybody's tired out of it. Everybody's exhausted. And if I could go just sit there, I'd go and do it as well. But the Lord doesn't want that for us. So, I mean, are you noticing the same kind of thing that the old guard, there's something happening with the old guard that's maybe God doing something, shifting on and making room for a new guard? I don't know. That's kind of my question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Jeff, and I appreciate you bringing it up. I think the fatigue that people have experienced over the last 18 months is very real. People are worn out emotionally and mentally, and I think it has surprised them at the level that they're worn out. And we were talking about this earlier. If you don't have kids in the kid ministries, it is so easy as an empty nester for you to pivot and just go online and just watch and be a passive observer rather than an active participant. And that would be fine if the message of the church was content. Our message is unique, but the secret sauce and the distinguishing mark of the church is relationship, not content. Now, again, the gospel is our message, right? So I'm not minimizing that. But our secret sauce has always been the unique way we relate to one another and the community that people find in it. So I think we have to go back to those fundamentals, recognizing that people have, rather than blazing new trails during COVID, staying well connected with our leaders in a very pastoral way is probably one of the most important things we can do rather than a missional way, because I'm constantly pushing and wanting us to grow. And hey, we have these disconnected people who aren't connected. And I realized in this season, success right now is paying attention to the care of our leaders at a soul level and making sure that they're feeling safe to express what they're navigating themselves. And so it's kind of taken a little bit of shift. I think it might be January in our talking. It could be next fall until we actually really see a semblance of normalcy. But again, if you don't have young kids, you can understand the how easy it would be just to watch online and disconnect for a season. Here's the thing that I think: once many of those people who left you will be back. I believe that, and the reason they'll be back is because the unique community that you guys were creating for them. Getting lost in a big place, living in anonymity, has an allurement for a season, but it has an emptiness over time. Mm. And so I would just say, pay attention to the condition of the flock in this season, and the flock being the leaders of your group, and just be very open-handed when people ebb and flow, which they're going to do during times of crisis, recognizing that you're going to be okay. More than anything, rather than pressing hard, we need to somewhat push pause and look inward, not outward at this point, to help people navigate what they're navigating personally.
Mm.
Thank you for that. That's probably something I got to own that probably I miss across this, because I've been very much thinking about how we can serve and look after people within our community that are doing it tough, and kind of maybe assumed that what was going on within the small group structure, and that was maybe at a depth that perhaps it wasn't, and maybe I should have been paying a bit more attention to that. So, mate, thank you very much for that.
I do think as well, before Perko kicks you out to the long grass in the unceremoniously way that he does on these webinars, what Bill said, I think is, yeah, it is. What Bill said, I think is my experience of church life as well. We had people leave because you demanded too much of us. We want to go somewhere where we can just be and exactly what Bill said. Many of them came back after maybe 12, 18 months. And so how they leave is really important. So if they do leave, just pick up a phone and love on them and tell them that, let's keep in touch, want to be your friend. I totally understand. Anything I can do to make that transition easier, want to do that for you. So there's a big wide open door if in 12 months time they're thinking, I miss Kevin and I miss the church, I want to come back,
Yeah.
I appreciate you saying that, Duncan, because the most hilarious thing is that I have a Bible group that I just meet and we read together once a week. There's only 3 of us in there, and 2 of the guys now have left us and going to other churches, but they still want to come and they still want to connect. So I decided to make sure that everything's clean when they go, and if they feel they need to go, they know they're loved,
Brilliant.
the doors open and that kind of thing. So, but I do feel like I have probably missed that with the overemphasis on the community and how they were doing. Maybe should have been paying a bit more attention to home. But yeah, we're keeping all the doors open. But I appreciate you saying that, Duncan. Thank you so much.
You're a great leader, Kevin. You really are.
Thanks, guys.
Kev, thanks, mate. And I'll send you back to the long grass. Duncan, you've got a couple of questions from the chat. And while you're asking those questions to Bill, I'm going to bring in another good friend, Chris Simpkins, to ask his question. But would you ask Bill those couple of questions from the chat for us?
Yeah, my friend Andy, who's one of the lead pastors of a brilliant church in the middle of our country near Birmingham, he asked a great question. He said, going back to the definition of the core that you gave us earlier on, what would North Point define as somebody? If I came to North Point, how would you define me if I was missionally engaged? What are the criteria for someone to be missionally engaged?
Yeah, so we did away with membership of our churches probably about 7-8 years ago, because we realized that membership was a pretty static thing, not a dynamic thing. It was a decision I might have made 20 years ago, but it may not be an active part of what we are doing right now. So we said, okay, who is our core? It's not our members necessarily, because we looked at database and we saw, good night, half the people who say they're members of our church aren't engaged in any aspect of ministry life. They're not in a ministry leadership role. They're not supporting the church financially. They're MIA. They're missing in action. So what do we need to look at? So we started talking. Now it's really the people who are engaged with us on a regular basis. And so from an engagement standpoint, we talk about they are serving in some capacity of ministry leadership. They are connected in the lifeblood of community life, and so they're in a group. They are giving in some capacity, and again, we talk about percentage giving. We don't, we obviously teach God owns it all, but part of being missionally engaged is supporting the work of the church, and so wherever that starting point is for an individual, we encourage them to do that. And then they invest in a bite piece. Are they actually engaged in the life of those who are outside the faith and helping them take an appropriate next step on their journey with Jesus? So that's what we look at as core. And so what we're trying to constantly do is move the needle of engagement in the lives of people, because I will tell you guys, it's really about spiritual formation at the end of the day. Why is giving so important? Well, because we know heart and treasure go together, right? And so that's a spiritual issue. Why is serving so important? Because God has given every person in the body unique gifts and talents, and I need them to help me grow, and the body needs me to help them grow. I mean, it's a reciprocal kind of relationship. You know, why do we need connection? Because we say it all the time, is that life is better connected, because connected people go further faster, and for a number of different reasons. So that is formation. It can be, we're just trying to move the needle of involvement, and it can look that way. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the why behind the what is because we're trying to form something in the lives of people, which is honestly dependence on God and interdependence on one another.
So just before Chris asks his question, just Andy wanted some clarity on that. It is, if I came to North Point and I served and I gave, but I didn't get into myself into a group, and I didn't invite my friends, would you consider me partly engaged? I mean, how many of those 4 criteria do I have to hit before you said, yeah, Duncan's an engaged part of our church, missionally engaged?
Well, yeah, everybody would be engaged at a certain level. What we would just continue to challenge people, and that would be, you know, put on us to challenge them to, who is your community? And we'll get into this, I think, in a little bit, but you know, the difference between community and group are 2 different things. Groups are human constructs that are trying to connect people relationally so they can grow spiritually. If I have community, then it's all about, you know, that's what I want for people. I want them to be missionally engaged with us and helping lead groups. But the real value is, I want them to have a group of people to where they're fully known, accepted, and loved. That's really what I want them to have. And so if that's happening in the life, and about 20% of our people would tell us they have community outside the church.
Okay.
It's great. That's fantastic. I mean, they're weekly meeting with somebody. It could be a work, you know, prayer group, accountability group, something else. That's fantastic. Now I want them missionally engaged with us and helping us to provide for others what they have as well. But my joke has always been, if they're not in community, then we should stone them. But the real goal is not group; it's community. That's what we want.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yes,
Jason,
Chris, mate, always a pleasure to see you, and it's great to have you on the webinar. Thanks for jumping in. You had a really great question. I'd love for you to just ask Bill.
Thank you. Yeah, Bill, thanks so much for getting up early for us. We really appreciate it. Just going back to group life and the stuff you're talking about what should happen in group. What would you say is the irreducible minimum for group life? You know, what are things that you have to have in a group for it to actually be an effective group?
good question.
I think it's just pizza, right, Bill? That's all you
Well, I mean, pizza and football.
it's the dream. You know, as I like to say, low expectations, high joy, right? So just keep those expectations low, and then everything is fine. You know, I think there is a sense of commonality. There's common purpose. There's common expectations. I think one of the things that we have to do a good job on is explaining to people when they get into one of our groups what it is they're getting into, because I think many times their previous experiences, maybe at other churches, maybe in campus life or something, was something totally different. And so they come in and thinking a group is this, and it's actually not that. That was, we would have called a prayer group or an accountability group or something. I think there's always going to be a relational and a biblical component. So there's going to be something. I'm going to lead with connection, but I'm going to move us and challenge us towards conversation around truth, because it's ultimately connection, as I said earlier, is the starting point. What we're trying to do is move the needle for people to have meaningful conversation around biblical truth, because it's when that happens that transformation happens. So we're trying to go from connection to transformation.
Good. That's good.
And that connection to transformation piece, we can look at it just as that's what I want, transformation, but it starts with connection, and it starts where people are, and we're breadcrumbing them along the way to where they ultimately are open to what the scripture might say about something, and then they actually apply it, because the application of it is what leads to the transformation.
Yeah,
So
I love
think,
that.
you know,
I love that idea.
Yeah.
I love that idea of connection, moving people from connection to transformation is to have conversation around the biblical truth. I just think that's great. So what's the irreducible minimum for a group? Then you need to move from connection to transformation, and you do that by meaningful conversation around the biblical truth. It doesn't mean Bible study or prayer, but it's a conversation around, around something true about Scripture. I love that,
Chris, you'll love it, because all three of those words, they end in ION, and you're a Baptist, so it's connection, conversation, transformation. It works well for a 3-point sermon. So
it needs to start. They all need to start with C, though, don't they?
They do. Right. They really do all need to start with C. We got to find a word that means transformation, but is actually a C word. That's good. But you had a follow-up question.
Can I do? Yeah, it's just going back to the pizza group thing. So if you had a group that was focused around pizza, but was intentional about, because the pizza's the connection, and I'm thinking maybe for guys as well, getting them into groups can be difficult. So that really relationally heavy thing, but was intentional about trying to get to that point of conversation. So not necessarily doing a series or a Bible study or anything like that. Would you say that's group and that's helpful, or would that still be that meaningless gossip or whatever you mentioned?
No, absolutely. I think we start where people are, right? And so let's don't undermine or de-emphasize what is part of a person's journey, and getting into a group just to sit around a table and talk about anything is so countercultural. I mean, for so many people. So the idea, and especially for guys, I mean, the idea of we're going to do, how many times have we seen this with wives who are dragging their husbands and trying to sell them on the idea of getting into a group, and the guy is asking all the way to group, we're going to do what? We're going to talk about who, feelings? No, I'm not. No. That's not what I do. And so I'm all for helping people take a next step, but you got to start where they are. That doesn't bother me. I just don't want to leave it there, And I'll tell you, the people who can be the hardest are the ones who have been around the longest.
Yeah.
And that's where occasionally having somebody fresh come into your group is kind of refreshing, because they come to you and go, whoa, let's get back on challenging each other to become the best versions of ourselves and really take the scripture seriously. And, young, hungry believers are good for us old timers, That's
right. So good.
That's good.
Chris, thanks for jumping in, mate. I know it's getting close to lunchtime in the UK because there's a lot of talk about pizza. So, hey, we'll see you soon. Thanks for jumping in, mate.
The Reverend Dr. Simpkins, it is always a pleasure.
Listen, while you unceremoniously boot Chris into the long Baptist grass outside the back of his church, just following on from what Chris has asked there about groups, Bill, because we're getting towards the top of the hour and I'm running out of time, but is there briefly, can you explain, because again, lots of our churches they often ask me about, is there a model for groups? What's the best, because there are so many different patterns and models. Can you help us with talk us through what's a good model for creating or recreating our group's structure as we come back out into the new normal?
Well, let's be, every group's model has strengths and weaknesses. I don't care, ours included. It doesn't matter whose it is. And there are some great ones out there. But I think it's important to remember, again, groups are human constructs designed to help connect people relationally so they can grow spiritually. That's what they're designed to do. But a good model is going to be one that I think starts with minimizing competing strategies. I think the church shoots itself in the foot constantly because it's asking people to do too many things at the same time, and we wonder why nobody participates. So it minimizes competing strategies. I think it makes connection easy because it talks about the process over a long period of time and makes it abundantly clear. I think it is modeled by leaders. I think that is a key piece to an effective model. It's not something I'm asking the people to do. It's something we do. So senior leadership has to be involved. I think an effective model provides a clear plan and an equipped guide. I basically love to talk about small groups and small group ministry. It says basically two things: a plan and a guide, a plan and a guide, a plan and a guide. What's our plan? Who's our guide? And so all of my focus really as a leader of groups needs to make sure that we have a clear, robust plan and an equipped guide. And then I would say an effective model is one that doesn't look at leadership development equally across the board. We connect with new leaders more than we do long-term leaders because we're trying to onboard new leaders well. So one of the things we're doing these days is in our first 90 days, most of our campuses are providing 3 touch points for their new leaders. They just want to make sure we're launching those experiences well. And we're very available to make sure that we don't have leaders or groups tubing out prematurely because they haven't been onboarded effectively. So those are just some of the things that I would put out there.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Super helpful. Jim Gallagher has asked a phenomenal question, but
That's who Jim is.
It is. I know. I love being around people that ask great questions. And he is a great question asker. I think, however, it's a question that could take its own webinar. If relationships are so important, how does that change and impact the way we do Sundays?
Ooh, that's so good.
So do we press pause? Do we press pause on that? Because now we're jumping into a whole realm of like, are we just spectators on Sunday, or are we connecting people? Is there ways of, connections and community on a Sunday? And we're talking about, service programming and thinking through, how we're doing that. So I say we press pause on that, but I say we lock Bill in for another conversation.
Well, I tell you what, let's press pause on it. But I want to, you were in the UK a week or so ago because I had lunch with you, and you'd gone to church Sunday morning. In fact, Chris's church and the church that Jim goes to. And it was a very different service to what you'd ever experienced before, and a very different service to what Chris's church normally put on. They'd just done it because it was the summer. But you found it incredibly interesting, didn't you? Going to Jim's point about if relationships are that important. Talk through your experience of that, because that highlighted the opportunity to build relationship more than a regular sitting in rows service.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, Duncan, because that's exactly where my mind went, is what I just experienced when we were at FBC. They were doing cafe church in the summer. And so knowing the summer coming out of COVID, sort of, I guess we're kind of coming out of COVID, and in attendance patterns were slower. They got real creative, and they decided to have cafe church where they would basically present some ideas and then talk about them around tables. And it really was the quintessential taste and see. That group is good. And I loved it because there was a guy in my group who was new to the church on that particular week. And everything in me wanted to just say, hey, can we stay connected via Zoom? Because he is hungry. He's at a real pivotal place. But then I thought, no, even better than that, he's got the right community where he is coming back to and he's connected to. So that kind of creative activity, and I think, and especially in unique seasons, is a great way to mix things up and give people an opportunity to taste and see, even in service, that this kind of connection and meaningful dialogue is useful and helpful for my spiritual journey. But I think that goes back to, Duncan, really importantly, to make sure that we do have what we talk a lot about is think steps, not programs.
Yeah.
And that you're thinking progressively, that whatever is coming out of Sunday has a next step to it, that it's not just an end of itself, but that to get the experience of the church, there's going to be a both and, if you will. There is going to be the content and the conversation, and that you're pushing both. But that was an extraordinarily creative way with Cafe Church to be able to do that. And and Chris and Matthew and those who made it happen on that particular Sunday did just a phenomenal job.
Bill, we have to wrap this up, and I hate that because I love these conversations, but I'm going to stretch this just a little bit longer. One last question, only because it's my favorite question, and so I can't leave it on the table. As leaders, we're talking about equipping the core, and we've already said it at the top of the conversation. We cannot give what we don't possess.
Yeah.
How do you equip your core, Bill? Meaning you personally.
Yeah.
How do you take care of your inner life? What does that look like on a practical level for you to care for your soul?
This is the $1 million question that we've all wrestled with, and hopefully we got rhythms around through our years. And let's be 200% honest. There are seasons and times that we do this really well, and there are seasons and times that we don't. And so this is where it's not you don't set it and forget it. You constantly are paying attention. But for me, I will tell you, and you'll love this, but it's really three things, and they all start with R, but this is really true for me. There's reading, there's rhythm, and there's reminders. Okay. So I heard years ago, who you read is who you will become. And I think that is so true. And for me, I think early in ministry, it was really a lot about theological and biblical learning. Then I moved into leadership, and I spent a lot of effort. But in these days, the people like Dallas Willard and Henry Nouwen and John Ortberg is my favorite of all, and John Mark Comer, who recently came out with it. But those are the people who have been speaking to what I need most, and that is really who I am at a soul level. I love Henry Nouwen. I am a Enneagram 3, wing 2, and so I like progress. I like to cross the finish line. I drive my wife crazy on the weekend because I have a list of things that I want to get done, and it's and it's just like, can we just enjoy? So Henry Nouwen made the statement. He said, you are not what you do, you aren't what you have, you aren't what others say about you, you are a beloved child of God. Everything starts and stops there. And so for me, that's the message that I constantly need to be reminded of. And so what I'm reading are those people who are reinforcing not my leadership, although I'm still reading leadership books, but my life at a soul level. And a mutual friend of ours wrote a book called Replenish.
Yeah.
And that has been extraordinarily helpful. So reading's real important. Rhythms for me is real important. So I want to be careful here because everybody has a quiet time, and we all know that we can dust through those quiet times pretty quickly. So it's a block of my daily rhythm starts in the morning. I read something devotionally to kind of get my mind attuned. but I'm a guy who tries to read the scripture for depth, not distance. And there's seasons that I'm just going through and I'll read several chapters at a time. Right now I'm just going through and I'm reading in 1 Corinthians, and I'm just trying to take a nugget and just unpack what it says to me. And then, so the rhythm for me is devotion, scripture, and prayer. Devotion, scripture, and prayer. And one of my biggest prayers is an acknowledgement of dependence.
Yeah.
I think you don't get past that. And I don't know why we think we do.
Yeah.
But John 15 is abundantly clear. We don't do anything of substance apart from him.
That's it.
And so that's so important. Chuck Swindoll said years ago, he said, God uses failure, but Satan uses success. And I think that's so true. Whenever it could be little successes, big successes, we can just preach a great message and feel really good about ourselves and forget that the one who made it possible was the one who called us into this to begin with. So I think those reading daily rhythms, and then I have a thing that I kind of conclude my morning with, and it's a morning reminder. And it starts with a confession and it ends with an ancient prayer.
Okay.
And my confession is just, I just remind myself every morning that God is alive and in control, that his promises are true and can be trusted. I remind myself that there is an enemy and he seeks my destruction, but my hope is firm and my future is secure because of him.
Yeah.
And I just every morning say that because I have to remind it, God, this isn't an arbitrary day.
Yes.
You are alive today and you are in control. And that your promises that you made to us, and then I made a list of 10 promises that he's made. He'll never leave us or forsake us, that he is with us, that he is in us, he is for us, and a number of others. But those constant, that confession is really important for me because it kind of starts it. And then I end my time with the ancient prayer of St. Patrick.
Yeah, so good.
Which is so good for me because, I rise today by your strength to guide me, by your might to uphold me, by your wisdom to guide me, by your word to speak for me, by your hand to guard me, and by your shield to protect me.
Yeah.
That is just and again, that's for me.
Yeah.
But I want to, there's a learning piece to this, there's a connection piece to this, and then there's a reminder piece to this for me. And I'm just at that place in my life where I need to be reminded as much as anything these days, because our hearts are prone to wander. Our thoughts tend to go to our last success or failure. And we just need to be reminded we are beloved children of the King.
Amen.
And it's out of that fullness that we operate in ministry.
Yeah.
Well, we hope this episode of Bricks and Clicks was helpful. If it was, then we'd love if you could leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you are leading a church in Australia, the UK, or Ireland, we'd love to help you grow your church by reaching unchurched people. Go to www.bricksandclickpodcast.com and click on your country's flag to find a whole bunch of free resources to help your church go further, faster, and become irresistible once again.